New York City as well. So we have a lot of work to do, and we definitely need all hands on deck here. And it really matters because, I mean, you think about the trauma that exists around violence, and if you can imagine living in a community where violence is so present, what that does not only to your psyche, but also to your health. It increases our rates of obesity and diabetes, and our life expectancy drops substantially. So I think everybody finding a way to, really play their part would be awesome.
So I also wanted to ask if you have any advice about how we can talk to our children about violence, especially gun violence in the United States, if there are any good resources that we can use.
This is a good question, and I've thought about this a lot. I personally don't have kids, but I have the best nephews in the world. And I recently was reading them a superhero comic book, and it was glorifying crime fighters and belittling, the quote unquote evildoers. And it was talking about violence in this, exciting, stimulating way. And you turn the page, and the hope is that the bad guys are going to get caught or worse, right? And so when we think about how we talk to our kids, what messages we're sending, what they're looking at on our TV screens, whether it's some cartoons or movies or even the news, it's really important to not glorify violence, right? I think we all have to be part of this. Violence is not acceptable, that people are getting hurt, and this is harming entire communities. So I think that's one piece, just talking to kids about violence, and of course in an age-appropriate way. And also knowing that, again, exposure to violence is the biggest predictor for later violence. And it doesn't mean that if someone's exposed, they automatically are going to be involved in violence. But to the tune of, if someone is chronically exposed to violence, they are 30 times more likely to be involved in violence later on in life. And there's studies that show that too. And intergenerationally, so children who've been abused or who have witnessed domestic violence, their likelihood of being involved with violence later on in life is significant as well. So knowing that is important, and then seeing the signs of trauma, whether it's numbness or hypervigilance or, just seeing or behaving in a potentially violent manner. It's so important to have a safe space to address this and talk through feelings and talk through what has happened, and also be able to know the resources that are in your community for individuals to seek help. And so, whether it's psychologists or counselors within schools, or if you have interrupters or outreach workers or community health workers within your community, that is critical. And children 0 to 5 are most susceptible to trauma, right? I mean, we're all incredibly susceptible, and we all experience issues around trauma. But 0 to 5 is a critical time, and the ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences. That study, which was completed by Kaiser with 17,000 people in San Diego, which was a predominantly white and affluent population, they looked at what happened to individuals from 0 to 5 and how did that transfer into their adult health. And they found that of 10 known traumas, which I want to say close to half are related to violence, but you also have poverty and divorce or single parent households, being homeless, having parents who are drug addicted, etc. If people had 6 or more, their life expectancy dropped 20 years, and their likelihood of being involved with drugs later on in life grew by 6,000%. So knowing what violence and other traumas do to children is incredibly important, so that we can begin to heal this process. But if you think about what we're trying to do here, which is ultimately prevent the violence so the children aren't exposed, so the parents aren't exposed, so it stops the cycle, you can imagine how many people's lives will be better off because we were able to prevent violence in the first place. So I think the more we could normalize nonviolent behavior and talking about our emotions and talking about healthy masculinity and how we treat one another is critical. So we have, again, some more information on our website, but I would just like to, have people think about how we talk about violence and what we expose our children to make sure that we're part of changing the norm away from violence being acceptable to living in a safe and healthy world.
I think that's great. I have two young sons, and it's it's very difficult to have them not talk about violence and think about violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of just out there in the ether, and they're absorbing it somehow from somewhere. And it's true. A lot of the books they read it's talking about like good guys and bad guys, and so we've been really trying to focus. It's hard in this kind of political environment not to think about the other side as bad guys, but we've been trying really hard to impress upon our children that, we don't wish harm on anybody. We don't,
Mm-hmm.
People are not bad guys and good guys. They are people who sometimes do things we don't like, who make decisions we don't agree with, but they're not bad guys. So, but
Right.
it's hard.
Yeah, and
It's hard to change that thinking.
absolutely, absolutely. And our choices are so dictated by our environment and what we're exposed to and what's normal, right? And I think, I used to work in nutrition and physical activity and doing health policy around those issues. And we talk about how, if you have 15 supermarkets that, sell fresh produce and it's easily accessible and it's affordable and it's safe to get there, then our likelihood of, consuming these vegetables and fruit is significantly higher. If we are surrounded by fast food restaurants and, we are constantly, just trying to make ends meet, and it's unsafe to really be walking anywhere, we're probably going to do the drive-through, get our $1 or $2 meal and have a massive amount of calories that's going to feel good for a moment, right? But we are making the choices based on what our environment is and how to essentially just get to our next step. And so when we think about violence, oftentimes we think about, that it's just random, or that, it's just even just like one incident with retaliatory issues, but there's so much backstory so many times where we have these red flag moments that pop up. So one example that I often give is about the child that was tackled by the school resource officer. It was, I'd say, probably about 2 years ago, and the child was in the classroom, and she apparently was very much exhibiting signs of trauma, but the teacher needed some assistance, and what no one knew at that time was that child lost either one or both parents the night before. I'm not sure of the exact details. And so, how can we make sure that, one, a child feels safe within all settings, two, there's protocols in place so that should something happen, should somebody be exposed to something, should somebody have the loss of a family member, whether it's due to violence or otherwise, it's a trauma. And how do we make sure that we handle that appropriately, right? And I think oftentimes when it comes to violence, things get escalated so quickly, right? And how do we instead all practice, these nonviolent behaviors and be part of really, creating a healthier and safer space. So it is a challenge to talk to kids about that. And, you oftentimes hear parents will say, well, stand up for yourself, or, if somebody punches you, then you punch them back and you punch them harder, or something along these lines, where we should not be promoting these things. But, what's the alternative? If someone does hit you, how do you come back with words, or how do you know who to go to, right? And just talking through all these things. One of our big pieces is even with our interrupters, who are often triggered, right, with being back in the environment that, allowed them to be credible, right? So here they are constantly exposed to violence. And so how do we make sure that they stay safe in those environments and that their trauma isn't, bleeding through? And how do we, essentially heal and continue to heal the wounds that are constantly being exposed? And one thing we do is, we make sure, like, rule number one is that they're safe. They're not going to enter into an environment where they're not safe or comfortable in that space. And I used to be an EMT, and that was rule number one, right? Like, safety first. You make sure that whatever environment you step into, that you're safe. And then you have exit strategies too, and you oftentimes don't go alone into places like this. So you're with somebody you trust, or there's somebody you could talk to immediately. So for kids, what teacher can you talk to about something? I had a younger cousin who recently just said to me that she was worried about something that happened at school, and I asked, can you talk to the principal, or can you talk to the counselor? And she didn't feel safe necessarily doing that. And I think, again, we all need to be able to make sure we are that person for kids and for everyone around us, for that matter, and that we're open to being able to be a safe space, and then get people to the appropriate resources.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been really interesting. I think that this work is really incredible, and I think this is such a unique model from the other kinds of things we've been hearing about for how to deal with violence. And it sounds like it's so promising and so evidence-based, and everyone should just adopt it. So
I agree. Thank you so much for having me on. And if anyone has any questions, my email is on the webpage, but it's skc1@uic.edu.
all right. Well, thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great one.
You too.
Our theme music is called Sweeter Vermouth and was composed by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. It is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Our logo was created by Matthew Weflin, expressly for Two Broads Talking Politics, and is copyright 2017. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or at twobroadstalk on Twitter. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and TuneIn. Please let us know if you have any trouble finding us.